All right. Hi, everyone. This is Max. I'm here with the European Time Zone Meetup group, and we're going to do a collaborative close reading of W.B. Yeats's The Second Coming. Not an American poet or an American poem, but one that's about a, say, modern experience that I think would resonate with lots of American poets back 100 years ago and today. So here we are, The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body in the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So, you know, light reading material on a Saturday afternoon. Does everybody have the poem in front of them? Does anybody need a link?
Got it.
All good? Okay, cool. Yeah, I just realized I could have posted that link. So this is Yeats's probably, I'm just gonna guess, most famous, most anthologized poem, written in the immediate aftermath of World War I, picking up some themes that the war had made really apparent about life in the 20th century and what life in the 20th century promised for people in the so-called modern world. It was going to be one of chaos, disarray, and violence, and that's what Yeats is writing about here. This feeling after the war of being not necessarily of being relieved that the war is over, but feeling like society is on a precipice and things are just gonna get worse. And he wasn't entirely wrong, to say the least. But that's a pretty common theme in a lot of, I would say, the high modernism out of England and Ireland that we're all that some folks might be familiar with. This sort of sense of looming chaos or disorder. That's a big theme of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. It's something that lots of that novelists like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce responded to. It's something that we don't see as much of in the American poetry that we discuss from the same time period in ModPo, which is, let's say around this time we have folks like the objectivists, or no, rather the imagists, I'm sorry, who are a little bit more interested in aesthetic questions and don't seem as preoccupied with these historical, like world historical problems that they were somewhat inured from living in the US and being so far away from the conflict that claimed the lives of many people in Europe, especially young men. So I don't know, what can we do with this poem? I think there's there's so much to do. I kind of gave the historical synopsis, but I think that it's about a lot more than what I just said, dude. The Second Coming, I mean, let's just start with the title, which I think is always a good place to start. Anybody have any ideas? It's obviously has a biblical connotation, but is there anything else it could mean? Yeah, Anna.
Well, first of all, I guess the second coming could also be like pointing towards the definition of the Second World War. So maybe coming is just another word, or just something that is closing this gap between the war and the now. And maybe the second coming might also mean something like hope. So if there was a first thing, maybe there will come something better, but maybe also something worse.
Right. I think that speaks to how the poem feels very prophetic, right? If we think of it as being written in this historical interwar juncture. Jenny?
I was just thinking that this is relevant to the fact that Yeats was Anglo-Irish, and at this time, the start of what is still going on of the various troubles between the Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland was taking place. And so for him, this time was in a way more serious than it was for most of the rest of us because of him being Irish. And he was a Protestant, going back to the biblical bit, but he was also a spiritualist. So his Protestantism disappeared and he was a spiritualist. And so this second coming is quite complicated, I think.
Sure.
And to some extent possibly comes out of his wife's automatic writing, which makes it even more complicated.
So you've introduced some biographical information here. Can you say a little bit more about the automatic writing practices that he and his wife were getting into?
Well, I don't understand it completely, except that they belong to quite an obscure private spiritualist kind of a group. And I don't know enough about the detail. So I think I can't say anything very, very useful about how it happens, except that it's supposed to come, you sit down and what you write isn't what you're proposing to write, it's what comes through you.
Right. So I can elaborate a little bit on that, but can you unpack what his Irish identity would have meant for his engagement with the First World War as a poetic or political subject?
Well, I think it would be complicated because he spent part of his childhood in England. I just dived into the biographical stuff because it seems so relevant to the poem.
Oh, sure, sure.
The First World War, it would be quite complicated in a sense because as an Anglo-Irish person, I don't know whether he was, I mean, he didn't fight in the war, did he? So
I don't believe he did, no.
I don't think he did. So I don't think he was called up, possibly because, but I don't know, because he lived in Northern Ireland. I don't know. I can't, I'm only seeing him kind of sitting in this place, which is different from sitting in England and different, say, from Joyce sitting in Dublin. That sitting in Northern Ireland is quite a difficult place in a way, because at that time the British ruled Ireland from Northern Ireland, which was not terribly popular with a lot of Irish people, particularly in the south and particularly Catholics.
And remained unpopular for many decades, even into
well, and it remains a problem today.
Remains a problem today. Yeah.
It hasn't gone away, it's simply changed. They're not shooting each other at the moment. That doesn't guarantee they won't.
That is some progress on that. Caroline, and then Jeroen.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, the First World War is very complicated for the Irish because at the time they are a colony. They are run by the British North and South. And so they're kind of the mixed feelings on the part of the Irish. And I don't know what Yeats's view of the conflict was, but I know there were people in the South, in the Republic, who signed up to fight, but there were also people who signed up to fight because that meant the British would give them guns. And so they went off, so they, and then came back, and then you have the Irish Civil War. But relevant to this poem, I think the other element is the Easter Rising of 1916, which had just been put down by the British in recent memory when Yeats is writing this poem as well.
Sure. It's a chaotic moment. It was a chaotic couple of years in Europe, obviously, but there are these domestic issues happening in Ireland as well, right? With the uprisings, and I linked to this poem, An Irish Airman Foresees His Death by Yeats, which is a sonnet, a sort of World War I sonnet, and begins to kind of point to a little bit more to the problem of being Irish in World War I, which is, as you were saying, Carolyn, it was young Irish men were being called upon to fight, the English war, right, basically. So it was quite unpopular and led to things like uprisings, and it was actually a very galvanizing moment for the nationalist movement, or the Republican movement. Jeroen?
Yeah, coming back to his other beliefs and the automatic writing with his wife, that was the point that I got completely lost in yesterday and this morning. He was a member of the Golden Dawn, and then when that spiritual weird stuff broke up, he got into one of the offshoots of that, and that's kind of a ceremonial magic stuff that was quite common around 1900, and it had this very deep link with the Egyptian old Egyptian gods and everything. So what I found fascinating is that he clearly talks about the Sphinx as the thing that is the second coming, and this is from 1990, and the last he left the Golden Dawn offshoot in 21, and he had this book, A Vision, that came out in 25 with his wife, about his automatic writing and all this self-realization that came with it. And yet somehow in this poem, the Sphinx is kind of, maybe it's almost devilish, right? It's very much contrasted with the first coming of Christ, and it really made me wonder. The second coming is that the coming of something evil, where the first coming was Christ, or is it the second time something bad comes, or is the Sphinx something bad? I really didn't know. The more I thought about it, the more confused I got.
And this is very consistent with the point that Anna started us on at the beginning here, which is the title alone, Second Coming, doesn't indicate whether what's coming is good or bad, right? Only some sort of return. Mm-hmm. And what you're saying here, Jeroen, I think is very is consistent with that, and this occult Sphinx-like creature that he goes on to describe in the second stanza, which we're meant to understand is the second coming. It doesn't really seem to have too much any specific moral value attached to it. Mm-hmm. We don't know. It's a somewhat terrifying image, right? It's walking through the desert. These desert birds are reeling around it. It's slouching towards Bethlehem to be born, which is this absolutely terrifying line. But is it a new kind of occult or let's say pantheistic or non-Christian spiritual substitute that's come to replace Christianity, or is it something more like an antichrist, right? I mean, obviously, in either way, it would be the Antichrist. But is it an Antichrist, like like a demonic Antichrist? Is it a bad thing that's coming? Mary?
Well, this, from the Christian Bible, Matthew, the King James edition, and he warns it's going to be a little bit. You better be ready because it's going to be like the flood. And in the 37, he said, "But as the day of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man." And this idea of the Son of Man was related to Christ coming another time. But before that, there will be a terrible disaster, like the flood. And he goes on to elaborate, when two people are eating and drinking, when other people are in the field, and all of a sudden this horrible flood will come along. So it could be related to the second coming of the Son of Man, which would be Christ, or the second coming of a thing like a flood, a catastrophe. And it's kind of, if you read the whole, I won't read the whole thing, but he said in the 44, verse 44, "Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man cometh." And so I think he's also related to this Christian version of the Bible. And I think that's what people expected during the first several years after Christ died, and they expected some miracle of good to come, a good Christ. But what Matthew insists on here is something terrible could come.
Right, and that's go ahead, Mark. I just saw you.
Yes, I agree completely on Mary. Our opening question was, what do we make with the title? The second coming. It's biblical, and yet it isn't biblical. It starts in the way the Revelation is written. There are many allusions to the Revelation, and the Revelation also has these bleak pictures, these terrifying pictures, what will come. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. What a strange image. It alludes to Shakespeare, to the Renaissance. I cannot remember that falcons are important in the Bible. What comes to my mind is Petruchio of The Taming of the Shrew, who tries to control the world, and the falcon cannot hear the falconer. There's no control. Things fall apart. And then in the second stanza, Yeats goes back to the Revelation. He alludes to the Revelation, and everybody expects that he is talking about the Messiah, the Lord, Jesus. But then he comes up with, where is it? The beast. And what rough beast! It's our come round at last. So it isn't the Lord who comes, and it isn't the second coming that everybody expects. And yet he gets back to Bethlehem, which is again a clear allusion back to Jesus Christ, the Lord.
Right. Go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, I was interested in that also. Maybe it relates to what you're saying. I'm interested in the line "falconer cannot hear the falcon cannot hear the falconer," partly because one little general thing I have is when you talk about animals, I think it's very interesting to actually study them, and then you may know more about what the poet's talking about. Often we say, well, let's just dig in and try and see what he's saying. But if you actually say, I've had a little experience with a falconer, and the interesting thing about a falcon is that it's not like you're the person who tells the falcon what to do. You actually motivate him with food. When you send a falcon out, he has to be hungry enough to know that he's got to come back to you. They say if you put the falcon out and he's eaten, and they can tell by touching the sternum to see how fat they are, they'll just go away. So, but I was curious about it is that the falcon cannot hear the falconer is almost we're almost there's some sort of lament there, as though it's a sign of chaos. But strangely, it means that someone is no longer dominant. And to speak to Mark, the concept of Lord, strangely enough, you think, oh, he's religious, he's using the word Lord, but what does it mean? It means your boss. So I think there's a little bit of irony in that, quite a lot, in fact, that maybe, we both want the Lord to be somewhat good for us, but maybe he's also our boss, and so we do need a revolution. So in that dichotomy, perhaps we see also the problems of the second coming, whether it's good or bad.
That's some interesting falconing context, Kurt. I was not aware of the intricacies of falconing. Other than so, since you're our resident expert, falconers, they're the ones with the gloves and they put the little hoods on the falcons, right? And then when you remove the hood, that's when he flies off, or she flies off the falcon. And
the hood,
they use
strangely,
hunt, right? Like I don't know.
The hood I find interesting. Excuse me. I'm sorry, because it actually calms them. They say there's too much sensory stimulation for them, and they'll be just too anxious. So they're actually happy to have the hood on because you're just saying, oh, I don't want to see this stuff. This is just too much going on. Because you think about their eyes and how sharp they are.
Yeah.
They're just seeing everything around them. So anyway, I'm sorry, I missed what your question was, though I interrupted.
No, I think you begin to answer it. Oh no, they use falcons to hunt. I mean, falconers, you send out your falcon to go like hunt like squirrels or something?
Yes.
Okay. Or mice or rodents, some small mammals.
Foxes.
They get foxes too?
In Mongolia.
Oh, jeez, okay. That's foxes seem kind of big to me, but I guess there are small foxes too. Mary, did you want to weigh in here on the question of falcons?
It's wonderful. It's interesting because when he said the falcon cannot hear, I had the impression it's like entropy. It's going around and around and around till it does fall apart, and the falcon gets so far out, it can't relate to the falconer, and the falconer can't relate to it. It's just entropy.
It's right, and it's like
turning and turning and turning until everything falls apart.
It's a sense of entropy before we have the term entropy. Susanna?
Yeah, I love this image of the widening gyre, that it's getting larger and larger, and then the center cannot hold. So the farther away you get from the center, the less stable it is. And the center that has been holding everything together cannot hold it anymore. And I'm finding it very interesting what's going on in the whole stanza, because this one we can understand, but the following gets further away from our understanding. It needs more interpretation. For instance, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Something that's very complex and very hard to understand. And so the progress in this stanza is that we need to work harder to understand what he really means, whereas the image is very clear in the beginning. And I would like to work on that a little bit as well, what's happening here. There's a few things that are very obscure, like the blood-dimmed tide is loosened, in this, the drowning. Of course, you have. I think it moves further away into a realm of emotion, where you have a flowing, something that happens with the liquids that he's talking about, blood-dimmed tides, and then the drowning, and then he ends with passionate intensity. So that's the feeling realm that I mean. First you start with a visual image, and then you get into something that we experience. That's how I see that stanza.
There's a really good reading of the kind of motion of the poem, and I know Christian, you wanted to weigh in, so I'll turn to you.
Well, the sentence that really spoke to me, that really clicked, it was is moving with slow thighs. And I just went into the Fisher King that's wounded at the thighs. And then it totally changed the whole thing, like he's in the desert because the Fisher King, like nothing can close around him. And he's slouching toward Bethlehem because the Fisher King needs the chosen one, and Bethlehem is where the chosen one is. So that's like, I didn't see the beast, in the desert as the second coming, but as the wounded that needed the second coming, and he was largely toward Bethlehem.
So the Sphinx creature is not the second coming, the Antichrist. It's a sort of symbol of this society that he's describing in the first stanza, right? Where the ceremony of innocence is drowned and the blood is pouring and all these horrible things.
Finally, the whole world, all the men, you know, is so wounded that it's largely toward Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is where the healing is.
Right. So going back to the source, that's an interesting interpretation. And we're going to go to Stanley and then Jenny, and then I'm going to ask some pointed questions about specific parts of the poem based on everything that everybody's been saying, since we've got to generate a lot of material here. But go ahead, Stanley.
Well, my handy dandy dictionary here, because I just looked up the word gyre, and it's like, you know, just to turn and whatever. But the very next word is called the gyre falcon, with a picture of this really plump falcon. And I could see what Kurt was talking about. if they're plump, they're not going to come back with your food or whatever.
What's the definition of the gyre falcon?
Yeah, he's a large falcon in the northern hemisphere, but he's just really plump, and I could see Kurt touching his. You said you've actually done that, right? You've been a falconer. Wow.
Just one day I went with someone who showed us how.
One day is more than most of us.
Yeah.
But this falcon, he's just really plump, and I could see that you want to, you know, slim him down a bit to be a good hunter. But the first two lines of this poem, by the way, my wife and I have been arguing for a few days. Is it poem or poem? Because she likes to do haikus, and when she puts the poem into it, you know, she gets 2 syllables. Anyway, so turning and turning in a widening gyre, it's like the whole world is exploding, and the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Well, do they hear the falconer anyway?
That's what Kurt was suggesting. In fact, that's not part of falconing.
Very interesting. Yeah, I don't think sound is a part of the process. So very interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's what I probably said when I said that the falconer controls the falcon. So the falcon hears the falconer. The falcon is controlled by the falconer. And just to add what Stanley said, I'm so impressed by the first 2 lines. The audacity that is behind that. You can hear the turning and turning in the widening gyre. And Yeats loses control, like the falconer, who cannot control the falcon anymore. He has no control over the verse. You have this enchantment. It goes on in the next line. And then he comes to the conclusion, things fall apart, even the poem falls apart. You do not have a rhyme scheme. You do, I didn't check, do you have meter here? No idea, but it goes more into prose, and yet he puts that in a kind of poetry. I think the first 2 lines, they are the best of the whole poem.
So Mark, you've started to bring us into the formal reading, which I'm going to hold on to that for a second. Let's go to Jenny first, since Jenny, I think you had something to add a moment ago.
Well, I've got 2 connected things, really. The Oxford English Dictionary definition of gyre is spiral or vortex. And in a sense, I'm looking at the contrast between the vortex of the first stanza and which would be the literati thinking, if you like, and the traditional thinking of the second stanza, where there's nothing new, things comes round and round and round again. And the second stanza made me think of Shelley's Ozymandias, with this sounds of the desert and moving its slow fires. It made me think of the 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone standing in the desert. And then when Jeroen talked about, Yeats being interested in Egypt, that suddenly made sense, because Ozymandias was about Rameses II, who was a very powerful pharaoh in the 13th century BC in Egypt. So there's a kind of sense, and the poem itself is about the transience of life. So that makes me think about the second stanza. Surely some revelation is at hand. Well, it may be, and it'll just be another revelation, in the sense that everything comes and everything goes, in the sense that it does with Ozymandias, that 13 centuries ago there was this very powerful king that none of us would ever have heard about if Shelley hadn't written that poem. And if you hadn't gone to school where I was, you might not necessarily have ever met the poem.
It's the Ozymandias, the reference to Ozymandias is or the comparison is an apt one. I posted it here in the chat, and I think that sort of speaks to the same, to the historical moment that Yeats feels himself to be in. I mean, Shelley's poem is kind of about how a once great, as you were beginning to say, a once great civilization can turn to dust and sand and be lost, right? And so that's sort of that's the experience of this romantic poet in the Shelley poem, where he's walking through and he's like, oh, that's crazy. There was a big statue here once of this king, and now it's all wrecked and ruined, and there's nothing here. But there's something similar happening with Yeats, where he feels like he's similarly at this peak of civilization, where Western civilization is saying, like Ozymandias does in the Shelley poem, look upon my works in despair, like this is modernity. We are driving bravely into the future, not realizing that it's actually on the precipice of its own destruction. So I wanted to start to follow Mark's lead and take us into a formal analysis of the poem, and I want to do that by maybe dwelling first on the first part of the poem, the shorter first part, and then moving back into the second part. So we started to generate a lot of information about relevant to both parts of this poem. We're talking a bit about falconing. We're talking a bit about some of the historical context that might start to explain what the blood-dimmed tide is. And then we've started to bounce around some different ideas about what's happening in the second part, whether this, where this monster is coming from. I don't know if it's monster, wherever this Sphinx thing is coming from. If it's a good omen, is it a bad omen? Is it the second coming itself, or, as Christian was suggesting, is it actually is it the part of is it a sort of personification of the wounded society that he's describing in the first part of the poem? So we've got a lot of we've got a lot of different avenues to pursue here, but I do want us to stay with the first part and talk about this entropy. And Susanna, you started to do that as well, kind of talking about how right off of the bat the poem seems to be like the terms of the poem seem to be widening. If the poem is a falcon, it seems to be also eluding Yeats the falconer, right? Maybe not though. Maybe it's actually not that simple. Maybe we can't quite graft that sort of meta reading on here. So he says things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And Mark, you started to say that this is in fact like a kind of meta moment in the poem, right? Where it's like things are falling apart. There's no clear rhyme scheme. It's not really. It's not like perfectly blank verse either. But is it really like a chaotic poem formally, or is it tighter than one would think? So another way of approaching this is to go back to this thing about the automatic writing that Jenny suggested at the very beginning. So yeah, Yeats was, and you know, part of this kind of like occult group where they were getting into some like pretty heady stuff where they were just like, with or without the help of opium, were like just writing stuff out that came to their minds, right? Like this kind of like, you know, 100 years ago, that was pretty out there, especially in the circles that he would have moved through. But here, you know, this isn't like an automatically written poem. Like it's not full of like non sequiturs and strange like associations. It actually kind of holds together. So yeah, let's maybe like talk a little bit about the form. Suzanne, do you wanna start?
Yeah, I just say the moment I like your reading that the falconer can't hold the falcon and he can't hold the poem, because when it gets to that point where we don't really understand it anymore, he stops the stanza and then he starts something new. So that's a big formal thing, and the stanzas are not balanced. The first one is shorter than the other one. So stanza was not anything they had in mind in the beginning. So he has to end it there. And there's this gap between the stanzas, and we can look at that, what it means. And then he, what is very interesting in the second stanza, that he repeats the second coming and he says, hardly are those words out. So that is automatic writing for me, that he lets it come out and then he reflects on it. And he finds, and then it evokes this huge image. And with the words, the image comes, and then he writes about the image. So that's also a formal consideration that he reflects on his own writing.
That's a good reading. There's something about the process that's here in the poem. Mark, and then Jeroen.
What I said before was that the line isn't line stopped. You have the enjambment. It goes on. It's such a wonderful beginning, and I'm sure that Yeats would have been able to write proper lines that really stop at the end of the verse, but he doesn't. He has this enjambment, and things really fall apart. Then and he loses control. The first stanza consists of 8 lines. Could it be an octave? Could be part of a sonnet? Hey, probably he was writing or tried to write a sonnet, and then he lost control. And when he came to sestet, he wrote more lines. Have you counted how many lines the second stanza has? 14 lines. He starts again. And this is probably also a second coming, the second coming of his attempt to write a sonnet. Things fall apart.
Nice.
It was an aborted sonnet followed by like a written sonnet. So
14 lines.
You're actually like you're elaborating Susanna's sort of processual meta reading, where there's we can read in the poem some traces of his own creation, right? That it's like
yes, and actually after the octave, we would expect a volta. There must be a break, and there is this blank line. And what I would expect is that the sestet comes, but it's a new sonnet, new attempt.
And so that's right. The second section is 14, so it is a sonnet. I'm trying to like kind of gloss it real quick.
Yes, it only has 14 lines. Do 14 lines make a sonnet?
Sometimes. Jeroen?
Yeah, what I was thinking for about the automatic writing, when you look at surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming with this exclamation mark, like it's a revelation. But you can also think of it because it's repeated with an exclamation mark, is a kind of a passionate intensity, which is the last line of the first stanza. So in that sense, he knew what was coming. in my idea, so it's right. Not completely that he had the first 8 lines and then started again and didn't know what was happening. The second thing about let's say, the formal aspect is in the first stanza is very much about the winding chaos, which reminds me of let's say the world ocean of when we the old mythological flat Earth with this horrible ocean around it, and then in the second stanza we go right to the center, which is the desert, the Egyptian desert, which is the center of this widening gyre. It's the center that could not hold, which means it goes to Bethlehem because it doesn't stay in the middle. So you get this water ocean in the first stanza and this desert dry thing in the second stanza.
That's an interesting ecological reading here of the two sorts of environments present in each. I had never even thought of that. Yeah, there's the flood of the first and the desert of the second. Anna, do you want to add something?
Yeah. First of all, I really love the interpretation of the sonnet because I haven't thought of that. But to me, the poem kind of holds together because I realized that there are a lot of parallel sentences and there are anaphors a lot, mostly in the first stanza. So he uses those stylistic devices to show that the poem is kind of something whole. And it is kind of a prognosis to me. It's not like, well, this already happened. It's like this will happen. So maybe he does not try to imitate the things that are going to be sometimes. He just wants to make a prognosis. And this is why the poem is written in something whole, something that belongs together and not something that falls apart.
Kurt and then Nunya.
I just had a small point on the first stanza. We talk about it gyring out, but you notice the last two lines are sort of a chiasmus, and I wonder whether that's sort of a culmination of the gyring out, because the chiasmus is very interesting. It's almost as though it's saying things are upside down. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. So you feel like it's turning out, and there's a upside down. I was wondering whether
the chiasmus, the sort of inversion of terms, is interesting. Go ahead, Yuya.
Yes, I wanted to come back to the meter for a second, because I really like the thoughts about if this, like if the stanzas really belong together or if they are rather separated. And I think the same thing with the crushing down and the crumbling that we see in the poem itself with the apocalyptic prognosis and stuff. I think we see that in the meter as well with the blank verse, because it's not just like the poem doesn't have a meter at all. It has the blank verse, but it sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. And I feel this kind of shows the deterioration of the world in a way, that sometimes you can see where the reason is, and sometimes you have a revelation and sometimes you don't. And I think that meter kind of ties it together as well, like two stanzas.
So this you're sort of understanding almost like the fluctuations in the meter, or the sort of unevenness of what we see as a blank verse as being almost like it's kind of playing with this chaos that the poem is trying to understand, right? Or this actual, it's the poem's really like this dynamic between chaos and order. So there's something like that. That's cool, because it does really seem like a blank verse. I kind of want to go back to what Anna was saying about the poem being a sort of prognosis, to try to think about where where is Yeats here? Like, where is the speaker? And is that important for our understanding? And what is he, what does he want us to actually take away from this poem? Anna, do you want to go ahead and jump right in, since this was your line of thought?
I think that the speaker himself is maybe still turning. So he sees that there is something coming, but he doesn't know what. So maybe he is right in the first verse of the whole poem, and the rest is just what he sees, but what hasn't come yet. So he describes the future, and he is in the present.
Okay, so he's looking right, and that fits with like Revelation and the vast images troubling the sight. These almost like prophetic visions of the future, and of course with the idea of coming, right, of something arriving. So he's attempting some sort of analysis or some sort of predictive thing of the future, and can't quite grasp it though, right? Like, is that he's not really sure what the future holds? Is that correct? So is he perhaps trying to create this sense of unease as well in the reader, perhaps with all of the various like uneasy formal things we've been tracking, like what Unio was saying about the verse, you know, as we're reading it now today, 100 years later, but I imagine folks who were reading this in 1920 would be looking at this and being like, this is blank verse. Oh, it's not really blank verse, and perhaps being almost more unsettled by that, especially if they were trained to read poetry a certain way. I think 100 years later, where we can have a different sort of understanding of that, but perhaps that the ambiguity of the meter and the form would have been more unsettling in readers in the past, and would have gone towards producing this kind of uneasy effect that's fitting with the poet's own unease about what's coming. And I think there's also other formal devices like the chiasmus that Kurt was talking about, where there's this inversion of terms that's also sort of confusing, right? Like the best are this, the worst are this, the worst are the best. All these things that are meant to make us feel uneasy and confused. Stanley, do you have something to throw in here?
Yeah, well, I just was really drawn to the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And that's what I really feel like this whole, the first verse anyway, is like how chaotic World War I was for the whole of Europe. And then the rough beast slouching into Bethlehem. To be born, if Jesus is actually coming back to Bethlehem to be born, and he's slouching. He's not even excited to come to this planet at all. It's like darkness. But that the ceremony of innocence is drowned. I think that is a real key to the poem for me.
Ceremony of innocence is drowned. Yeah, the loss of innocence, right? And feeling it here in 1919 more than ever before. Jeroen?
Could I just, sorry, just a quickie. Maybe the ceremony of innocence is drowned refers to baptism, because it's a baby drowned and there's water involved. So it's like going too far somehow with your, just a little suggestion.
Sure, and that brings us back to the kind of ecological readings, right? Of what body of water is this? Is this a flood? Is this a basin of holy water? Is this let's go ahead to Jeroen, and then we'll go to Jenny, and then we'll start to call the falcon back in on this one.
I wanted to elaborate on something Anna said, because she said the first stanza is right, the here and now of the poem, and the second stanza is somewhat prophetic. But what is interesting is that the only time Yeats is actually in the poem is when you see now I know, and troubles my sight. It's in the second stanza, so he really tries to be the prophet here.
Mm-hmm.
So that I thought that was interesting.
But he's is he okay with being a prophet?
He's a bit overwhelmed, I guess.
Sure. And
Not knowing,
I think we can kind of
what we talked about earlier about the ambiguity of the prophecy, yeah, which is closer to the automatic writing when you don't have the control. So it's something big. Well, it comes out of the spiritus mundi, which is the spirit of the world. It's bigger than he is, so he doesn't have to understand to see.
But we also, I think that this is, you know, this is what's also so like unsettling about this poem, is that these various trying to be prophetic, trying to use these strategies that we know, you know, biographically, like automatic writing and these occult things that he was into. You know, even just the writing of poetry, right? As if we want to follow Zena's analysis and think of him being like, okay, second coming, like, oh wow, that means all these things, and here I'm writing it into a poem, right? All of these various strategies he has to try to foretell anything are fraught and don't seem to bring him too much comfort at all. So it almost begs the question, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you why are you doing this? Jenny, do you want to go ahead and
yes, it connects a bit to what Jeroen's just said. But I just want to go back to the first stanza. We haven't looked at those two words, mere anarchy, which are in the middle of the first stanza, and in a sense relate to what he's describing in the first stanza. And that's just mere anarchy. And in the second stanza, in a sense, he's going for complete anarchy. And this is one possibility of the horrible things that might be coming that are even worse than what we've got at the moment. But the other thing I wanted to look at was Yeats's definition of spiritus mundi, which is a universal memory and a muse of sorts that provides inspiration to the poet or writer.
Right. So this is part of his.
So that's Yeats's description of what spiritus mundi means.
The world spirit, right.
It's a world spirit, but it's also a universal memory and a muse that provides inspiration to poets and writers.
It's these aspects of the poem are often, since we're here nearing the end of our collaborative close reading and we're only now talking about what the heck spiritus mundi would be, these are aspects of the poem that are frequently overlooked, which I find quite interesting. And it's a poem that gets, so very famously, the last line has, lends itself to the title of Joan Didion's first collection of essays, published in the late 1960s, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And it's also the title essay that Joan Didion wrote in 1967 about what was happening with the counterculture movement in San Francisco. And thanks, Kurt. Slouching Towards Bethlehem. So Joan Didion was, her whole thing in 1967 is to look at the hippie movement, and rather than either like sort of make fun of it like people were doing in the mainstream, or herald it as some kind of like, oh, really great, like peace and love movement, she sees it as the sign of the center not holding, of anarchy being, loosed upon the US, and not because she was like anti-hippie necessarily, but because she saw it as a symptom of like a greater crisis that was taking place. And this is like 50 years after Yeats. Right. So, this feeling is continuing throughout the 20th century. And I swear, like in the last like 10 years, there have been so many things that have been like slouching towards Washington or whatever, these kinds of things in the US where people are always like recycling these lines and the kind of like, apocalyptic, prophetic, uneasy associations that we have with this poem, recycling them into kind of contemporary cultural commentary or social and political commentary, because of just how like bloody powerful they are. But at the same time, in that we've always, we overlook these stranger, more occult things like the spiritus mundi, and what's actually kind of taking place here in this poem, which is this in some ways this kind of like unsure attitude towards the ego. Like, is he want Does he want to be overwhelmed by the Spiritus Mundi? Does he want the Spiritus Mundi to speak through him? Does he want to sort of dissolve into it? Does he want to be, you know, or is he trying to stop? Is he trying to stop the tides? Is he trying to recall the falconer? Like, it's not really clear. And you know, the different you know, the different attitudes he has towards things like inspiration, like with the Spiritus Mundi, where, you know, where you're just telling us, Jenny, it's this idea of like, you know, the world spirit, the collective memory, this kind of thing that you know, is really anti-individual, anti-ego, something that you would sort of, that would overwhelm you, as you were saying, Jeroen, like it's something that you lose yourself in. He seems to want to channel that, but at the same time, he seems really uneasy by the but by the social disorder that he's seeing around him. So it's really it's not clear like where he stands with respect to what's happening. Any like final thought on this, Susanna?
Yeah, I have a thought. First of all, Joan Didion passed away very recently, I think.
Last December, yeah.
Yeah, and so what I wanted to say is that there's a huge critique of Christianity in it, and that comes to show in the 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and that for him shows in his vision. And what I see in it is that Christianity has shaped our view so profoundly over until his loosening from the grip of viewing things in a certain way, and that his own vision counts at this point, and it's stronger than the tug between the falcon and the falconer. This connection is lost, and now man is on his own, finding out and getting nightmares, and realizing from the nightmares that there's a true, I guess, opportunity for him to see things on his own and not being basically caught by this this myth of Christianity that he's critiquing in this, criticizing.
Sure.
So I find strong. That's a strong. I guess he needs to find out what that rough beast means for himself, and he doesn't know it.
That's exactly, yeah, that's a really good way to start getting into the Christian critique that's happening. Anna?
Yeah, and also about the rough beast at the end. I'm just thinking about that if you have read this poem in the past, so when you were at about his time, and then you read this poem, I guess you would have experienced something like fear while reading that, because it's more of a question. And I love what Suzanne said about it, that you cannot say what this rough beast is. You have to figure it out for your own. And it's just a question that mixes it up at the end. So what is this rough beast? And I guess it's like an open ending if you're reading a book, and you have to imagine for yourself. And that's what I love about this poem. It's this darkness, and at the end it's this fear you take with you out of this poem, and you're thinking like, yeah, maybe sometime there will be this rough beast and no one knows what it is, but for yourself you can make it out.
So there's almost this invitation to interpretation at the end. Yeah, that's yeah, which is in some ways a very modernist gesture, and is very, I think, very fitting with the critique of Christianity, where there's less, I suppose there's the Bible is interpreted, but always in relation to the Bible. It's a very, like, biblical interpretation is not a sort of open interpretive practice. It's one that's very much meant to try to make sense of the whole Bible as some sort of like authoritative ultimate text. Whereas here you have this rough beast and you're like, oh geez, God knows what it could be. But this is what's going to replace 20 centuries of Christianity is this far more arcane, open to interpretation system of belief, maybe. we should, since we're well into our second hour, we should probably switch gears to the Auden. I'm gonna grab just a drink of water.
And can I add one more idea? Did you notice where the final couplet of my sonnet is? Kurt, you're completely right. Everything is upside down. You have, I interpreted the second stanza as a sonnet, and it starts with the final couplet, and then you have the other 12 lines. Or is it a couplet at hand, and these are the final words. So maybe he has these 8 lines as an octave. Then he comes to his final couplet, which he has at hand, as he explicitly says at the end of these 2 lines. And then you have this sonnet where you have the final couplet at the beginning and then the sonnet upside down.
I like this idea of the inverted sonnet because it's very fitting with the chiasmus as well, like and just the general sense of inversion happening, right? That the which is a, you know, there's so much more. You could talk about this one for days. There's just so much more that could possibly be said, just even about the spatial logic that's happening. You know, we did talk a little bit about the gyre widening, the sort of spiral motion, but how does that fit with the sort of temporal logic of prophecy, or of the return of the Christ? You know, that's a very different like narrative logic compared to what he's talking about, centers not holding and things falling apart. There's so much that's like, there's so many like overlain logics here that, you know, you could talk about forever. Yeah, indeed, Caroline. If you have to go, no worries. You just knock off whenever. Yeah, we could.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I mean, the thing I've really enjoyed. This is a familiar poem, and yet I've got so much out of these discussions. You know, because it's amazing that every time you come back to it, you see something else in it and learn something else about it.
It's a truly astonishing poem. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, yeah. I think my favorite 2 lines as well are the 7th and 8th. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I think that applies so often in modern life, doesn't it? You know?
Everything is so frustratingly, depressingly relevant that like, what, you know, why is, in some ways, you know, the prophecy is true, right? Like if we take this as a sort of prophetic poem, right, like Anna, you were saying, in some ways the second coming is the Second World War, right? Yeah, and 20 years later that's what happened. Or, you know, the 20th century, that he's writing about the 20th century at the beginning of the 20th century, and seems to more or less call it that there's going to be these like returns of chaos and instability over the course of the next century. And it's just kind of, it's unsettling how accurate and relevant so much of this is to the present. Let's get into the Auden poem, since we have a little bit of time left. This one's a bit longer. It's written in 1939. So the other irony, of course, is that Yeats dies at the start of the Second World War, just like James Joyce. You know, these people who seem to be like really these European Anglo-modernists who seem to be really like so ready for the worst things to happen. You know, they didn't actually see it, but they weren't wrong, right? They were. I mean, I guess Yeats kind of knew what was coming. So yeah, this is Auden's tribute in 3 parts to W.B. Yeats on the occasion of his death. It's called In Memory of W.B. Yeats, and I'll go ahead and read it. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays. By mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poem. But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumors. The provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Part 2. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making where executives would never want to tamper. Flows on south from ranches of isolation in the busy Greece, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. Part 3. Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace shares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie, locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night, with your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, deserts, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Mary, you requested we read this. Do you have like an initial comment or question you wanna toss out to maybe get us started?
I mean, well, I chose it because, first of all, I love Auden because he's like a juggler. He can do any kind of verse about any kind of
As he demonstrates in this poem.
yeah, so that's what but then I thought as we think of poetry in the ModPo vein, but poetry is not dead and it is important. And even though he said poetry cannot change the world, it does in a way. And especially through the ModPo experience. So that's why I thought it would be interesting for our group.
That's a good place to start. I think there is something very when he says, oh, I'm trying to find it again, where he says poetry doesn't change the world. Where is that?
Middle of stanza 2.
It's in stanza 2. For poetry, yeah, okay.
It makes nothing happen.
It survives in the valley of its making where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs for all towns that we believe in, die in. It survives a way of happening in the mouth. So he says for poetry makes nothing. It's interesting. So he's not outright saying that poetry is like, useless in some sort of like purely artistic way, right? Like that it's that, if we think of art as something that doesn't have like a practical use. He's saying that it makes nothing happen, but what it does, it still does something. And that I think, I don't know, should we start to parse these lines here in our sort of handy dandy, more compact second section? In you were silly like us, your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurts you into poetry. So there's a bit of the Irish, the Irish identity thing here that we were talking about earlier. Now Ireland is her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper. Like what a really like heady, almost like postmodern line. What does it mean? Like it survives in the valley of its making, where executives, who are the executives? Unia, do you have an idea?
I'm not really sure, but this reminds me of a quote of someone. I wrote that down recently because I was watching TV, and it was an artist, I think from Ukraine or something, because think that's what that was why he was on TV. And he said art is the diagnosis and not the medicine. And this really reminds me of this right here, because I think that's what poetry is as well. I mean, it's the diagnosis, it's what artists do to kind of cope with the world. But it's not what makes the world whole again, it's just the diagnosis.
I like that, and I think that's very fitting here. Like let's run with that idea. So what is, you know, if art is diagnostic, you know, how is poetry performing its diagnosis in Auden's imagination here? And I think he means like he's kind of talking about Yeats, but he's also just, it's sort of an ars poetica. He's also kind of just talking about poetry in general. What is, you know, what does he imagine poetry does? Perhaps to perform this diagnostic rather than like palliative function. Anybody have?
Well, the first thing to see is that when you see the first part, the end of the first part, as just a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of the day when one did something slightly unusual. It would mean that the death of Yeats is only important to some, and that goes well into in the valley of its making, where executives, people, well, in my mind, business people who are more busy with money than with something else, they would never want to temper because it's not interesting enough to them, because it doesn't make something happen. It's a way of happening, a mouth. So it's really poetry as something that is not powerful, but a way of expressing. So indeed, a confirmation of a diagnostic.
That's great, and I think it's so essential to sort of connect the dots in this part here, right? Like it's, for poetry makes nothing happening, it is a way of happening, right? Or makes nothing happen, it is a way of happening. Anna?
I also think that he's just speaking of poetry as something that is just existing, and you can come into this valley of poetry if you want to. It is open for everyone, but it is also surviving because there are some people who keep it alive. And then he says, and this is to me the most important part, in part 3, he says, let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. And I guess it's kind of interesting because he's putting kind of like a synonym to Yeats, because he's just thinking like, he is the Irish poetry, and it survived such a long time, and now this valley is kind of empty, and maybe someone has to come there and remember, so it can be kept alive, so it can survive. So to me, poetry is just something that can survive without other people, and even if in this valley it has to be kind of under protection, because if you're in a valley and then there's something like the weather, and you are protected in this valley because it's just kind of a bowl, and it is protected, but you have to protect it as well. And I guess that is the primal thought of this.
It's there was a great connection of the valley with the vessel, and it's making me think of the various containers of poetry that are evoked here in this poem. And what you're saying about the valley being something that anybody can enter, but something that nevertheless needs to be protected, I find very interesting. And I wonder if we can maybe say more about like what the container of poetry that Auden is imagining here, what its function is, or sort of what makes it unique. So I'm thinking of the executives. What a strange like call out, right? It's poetry will stay in its valley, its sort of vessel. A valley being something where water might collect, but also a place that might be protected from certain weather events. But it's also it's not hostile to the executives, but it's something that the executives, whoever they are, don't want to like go into. Let's go ahead, Anna, with you since this was your train of thought, and then we'll go to Mary.
Yeah, I see what you mean, because I love this interpretation, like you can go into poetry and seek protection as well. It's needs to be protected. So the valley is not like you can overcome this valley if you see, for example, castles that are built on hills to see into those valleys, to be protected of enemies. But you can also search this valley to be protected in it as well. So maybe poetry just does not only need to be protected, it is also a protection for yourself, a place where you can seek something, where you can go into and just relax or find something more than just usual.
So yeah, that's interesting. There's this idea of, so there's the Irish vessel that's emptied of its poetry, right? As though like Yeats were born, and then like all the poetry of Ireland just kind of like accumulated in him and was like periodically let out, and then you know he died and it was all empty. So there's that kind of like that idea of the vessel as almost something that's like transmitting, and then there's this other idea of like a container, a different kind of vessel or container is something that's actually like protective, that you can go into, right? It's not something that things are flowing out of, rather it's something that like you can kind of seek refuge in. Mary, and then Kurt. Mary.
Okay. But the very word executive, because executives make things happen. They execute a law, they're powerful. So they wouldn't want to tamper with ideas that spoil their power. And maybe poetry might do that. That's it.
Right. That's a good understanding. I'm still wondering who these executives are, though. Kurt.
Yeah, I was very struck by the vessel lie empty of its poetry, and I think I try to explain why. And I think it's because usually when someone dies, you sort of think, well, I wish you could live more and give us a little more poetry. And so there's something fatalistic about it. They're saying that, well, he died at the right time when he was used up. And so you're saying that it was meant to be somehow, because you can't just say, hey, he's empty. Well, he could have lived another 10 years and give us some more poetry. But no, he was empty. By definition, he's dead. He's not going to come anymore, period. And so that's I think that's why I was struck by that line.
It is striking, and it's almost a way of grappling with his death and his no longer being here in a way, right? And saying like, by kind of forestalling the question of what could have been, what more there could have been, by saying like, yeah, I mean, he was used up, and this is it. You know, there was going to be no more poetry. Obviously, nobody would really believe that, but it's a way of memorializing him, right? To sort of tie his biological existence to his poetic capacity.
But isn't he emptied by death? I mean, it's more the way you now describe it is like he was emptied of his poetry, as so it's okay, he died. Is that the other way around, that death made it for him impossible to write more poetry? And on the other hand, he's emptied of his poetry because it's spread out into the world, and a lot of the poem is about other people interpreting the poetry of Yeats when he's no longer here.
There's so this conversation makes me want to look. Christian,
your gift survived it, your gift, his poetry survived it all. So sure. when it was he is empty and his gift is still there, it's a way of happening.
There's there's like a comparison I want to pursue here with the last poem, kind of about this idea of the self, the individual, the ego, you know, the male genius being or encountering something larger than it. Because I think that's taking place here in this poem. It's not as like it's not as like horrifying as it is in the other poem, but I think something similar is taking place. But Christian, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was wanted to come back to the valley. You know, in wartime, the valley is the dangerous place. Like, you know, you want to be on higher level to be able to see things and to be able to defend yourself. So the poet is in the valley, like they create the valley, but the valley is also where everything flows. It's like where the flow of things and the you know, in order to go from one place to another, you need to go through the valley. And the executives don't want to go in the valley because that's dangerous. But the poet creates the valley where it's a place where things move.
That's that's I like that reading a lot of the flow. So the valley is created by the flow of the river. I mean, you know what, I'm not a geologist, I don't know if that's true, but I think there's some relation to the flow of the river and the valley, right? That's just suggested, because maybe, you know, maybe it's something else. But I think that is quite pertinent here. The things run down into the valley. Anna, do you have something to add?
And the executives don't want to go in the valley because that is the dangerous part.
Right. And it's strategic. Yeah. So higher ground is always strategically better in a conflict. Anna, did you have something to add?
Yeah, also according to the valley, maybe the valley is just a place you can divide kind of in two places, because at the one hand, of course, it can be dangerous, but at the other hand, the term alone lets me think of something like peace. So the valley of peace. And there's in the valley, there's like forests and rivers and all those tiny little things that show there's life. So I just like the interpretation of movement in the valley, because it's kind of like you can or you have to protect this movement. And if you kind of say poetry is a synonym to this valley, or is in this valley, like being in a container, you can also say that poetry does mean movement, and maybe it also means life. And we read the first poem of the author himself, and it was also like that. There was kind of a movement in it, and there was kind of life in his poetry, and I guess maybe that's also the point.
Susanna and then Jenny.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer to Kurt, whether he's just dying and giving up kind of, and he won't write anymore. I think the first stanza really tells us how important their death is, because what we were just talking about, the valley and kind of the macroscopic view of the valley, is in the first stanza as a microscopic view of the landscape that is really spread out in the body of the poet, and also as the landscape itself. And that's really goes so far into so many lines just describing what's going on in that landscape of the poet. And I find that as like a counterpoint to what Kurt said, and what we find in the second stanza, where we just take the metaphor of the valley, and in the first we have it all spread out in words, and it describe in length, like really spread out, like a landscape is spread out.
So let's go to Jenny, and then we can sort of unfurl some of these like spatial things that are taking place. Jenny and then Mark, and then we'll go.
I just want to look at the end of this stanza when it's saying it survives a way of happening, a mouth. And the mouth refers back to the very first verse, when you have the mouth of the dying day. But the bit before the mouth, from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in, it survives, a way of happening, a mouth. And if you go to the very end of the third stanza, the last two verses, with the farming of a verse, which goes back to your ranches of isolation, make a vineyard of the curse, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. But then, in the deserts of the heart, which goes back to the second coming. Let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Auden is leaving us with a much more upbeat ending than Yeats did.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Mouth of poetry to do something completely different. And I like that as an example of the mouth of poetry.
It is very upbeat and it almost, I know this is Auden, he's a different poet and he's commemorating Yeats, but there's something that, but you know, when you read these poems side by side, and you actually read what Yeats was writing about, there's something kind of incongruous about the upbeat note of that throughout this poem. You know, he's writing this in 1939, and instead of being like, oh my God, like Yeats is dead and he was so right, like this shit's gonna hit the fan. He's kind of like, yeah, you know, he's created a way for us to, you know, he's been more optimistic about the future. Mark, did you want to add something?
Yes, so to me, valley is an image for deeper meaning. The valley is the landscape that goes down. We lift up our eyes to the mountains, but the deeper meaning that is in the valley. To me, it's an image for deeper meaning. For poetry, makes nothing happen. Literature offers no solutions and no instructions how to change the world, but literature accuses. It makes obvious what's going wrong, and that's what he says here. It survives in the valley, it survives in the deeper meanings. That is what Yeats has left behind. Max, you mentioned these three parts, and three parts indicate that this is an elegy. Elegies are usually written in three parts. First, it starts with what has happened, namely somebody died and everybody's mourning. And then the second part is about what the dead person has left behind. And section 3 continues with the future, what can happen.
Right.
And this Irish vessel that is mentioned, it alludes to the mythological bark, to the sticks where the dead people go to. Yeats is a poet. We're part of literature. It's the realm of mythology, and he is in that vessel, in this ferry, the spark that goes down the sticks, but it's empty. Nothing is in there anymore. We have lost somebody.
He's crossed the river in the sort of classical notion of the river of
right.
Styx, right? Mary?
I think we jumped over one of the most important lines in the second stanza in the first part, when he said the death of the poet was kept from his poems. That means the poems don't die, they just keep going. As what Jeroen said before, that they become international, they become worldwide and meaningful. So the death of the poet was kept from his poems. There were no death for the poetry.
That's thanks for that, Mary, because that leads right into the question that I wanted to ask, which is what is Auden saying about, so we have a little bit of a sense of what he's saying about the death of Yeats in particular. We have a sense of what he's saying about poetry in a somewhat more abstract general way. But what is Auden's philosophy or theory of poets dying in general? So they, we have this idea that in this line that you just read for us, Mary, the death of the poet was kept from his poems, and we have, elsewhere we see this idea of the vessel, the empty vessel of the poet, his poems now belonging to, in this case to the nation. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. They can belong to the world or something. They can belong to everybody else. So what is his theory of poets, of poets dying, maybe even death in a even larger way. Jeroen, did you have something to?
Yeah, in almost the end of the first part, he says the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So that's his idea is that we, the living, can do whatever we want with the words of the dead man. They're modified, so they don't stay the same. And the guts, the innards, that's really the part that we digest the dead man and change it to change his words to what we need or what we think.
So
it's kind of brutal.
Yeah. Can you point us to that line again? Sorry, I'm just.
It's
oh yeah.
Mostly at the end of the first part. The words
Okay,
of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living.
Somebody's phone. And right, okay. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. This, okay, so we need to actually like figure out what the heck is going on here. Really, where the sense of scale is all over the place. And we're starting with he's scattered among 100 cities. Like, okay, it's a nice idea. And wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. Okay, so now, being in other cities means some sort of encounter with strangers or with others. To find his happiness in another kind of wood. Okay, so we're not in the city anymore. Now we're in a rural setting. So we
yeah, that's what I landscape, Max. That he's spreading out this vast landscape where the poet is residing in some ways, and however he resides in the poetry, and also it's not quite. I mean, it is. He refers to the provinces, the squares, the suburbs. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Right. There's the suburb is this sort of blurring of city and wood. So yeah, he's spreading out like vastly across the landscape to the point of being in foreign, is his foreign code of conscience, to being in foreign nations, right? So he's going further, like exceeding the boundaries of his own nation. But then this last bit, the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So he almost like enters, if we go with the landscape thing, he enters the earth, becomes part of the soil, as part of an agricultural process. Like he's feeding now the things that people eat, which are being modified, metabolized in the guts of the living. And so he becomes like, like microbiotic or something.
It's leaves of grass all over again.
Yeah, it's leaves of grass all over again.
With the farming of a verse, making a vineyard of the curse. So that's in the last stanza. We have that farming aspect also.
So he's becoming something consumed in a very literal way. Anna, do you have something to add here?
Yeah, I guess he does not only play with the landscape, but he does also play with the weather. In general, he's playing a lot with nature, like using metaphors and so on. But in the first part, at the really end, it says what instruments we have agreed. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. And what's striking to me is that he said that at the very beginning as well, like in line 6. He also said that. And well, repetition just means he wants to stress something out. He wants to express something really strong. And it was a dark and cold day. So if you just read those 3 words at the really end of it, it just says that about the death of the poem himself, that it was sad, yes, but it was more than sad. It was dark and it was cold. So it's not only a feeling, you can also see it, kind of. And to me, this is just a striking line because he repeats it, and I guess this repetition is kind of important.
I'm looking for the first instance again. Right, oh, it's at the end of course, yeah, it's the end of the first stanza. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. That's kind of cool too. I think that there's this sort of juxtaposition being set up with two different kinds of worlds in this poem, and so right, the instruments can measure, as you're saying, Anna, they can measure that it was in fact a dark cold day. Like the weather seemed to be like in sympathy with what was happening, right? Like it was like a big, you know, a titan of poetry died, and the weather seems to be mourning with him too. And you know, of course, weather is a very local phenomenon, so that calls into question, you know, where this is exactly, that the weather is dark and cold. But in some ways, the way he repeats about the instruments, the instruments we have agreed that it was a dark, cold day. It seems like very different in some other ways than some of the other natural language that he's invoking. Kurt, do you?
Yeah, let me propose this. I love it when they repeat things. It's sort of like a refrain in a song. It seems to be like the universal that you return to. You went off to this little land, and now, oh, by the way, I'm going to come back to the center. And the way I see it is this: the first instruments. He's talking about instruments like a thermometer, but the second time it's like a concluding statement, and he's talking about our instruments of our mind. Is that he's doing all this reflection. Oh yeah, by the way, the instruments we have, including my capability to reason and to write poetry, you return to the same conclusion. And I think that's why you come back to the same sentence. You sort of evaluate in a new way, and you say, this is the universal line. And I like the idea that the instruments is our mind. And the second time he says it.
The instruments, so what instruments we have, what faculties we have, what senses we have.
Yeah.
Right, as sort of empirical proof of what our weather instruments, thermometers and barometers and so forth, are also confirming. Jenny and then Susanna.
I just wanted to come back to the way that all the way through this poem, he's comparing rural things and urban things.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important in Yeats, because before poems like The Second Coming, perhaps his best known poem was The Lake of Innisfree, which is a very approachable, comfortable nature poem. And by this constant comparison of the urban and the rural, he's reminding us that Yeats comes from these various different places.
The Lake Isle of Innisfree poem is 100% his second most famous poem. And there's, I just have to look it up real quick because I had some sort of inkling of something, but I think maybe I'm wrong. Right, it's more of a nature poem, but also I think the Lake Isle of Innisfree is playing with, right. He wrote the Lake Isle of Innisfree after he was walking around, I don't know, in a city, and he sees an advertisement or something, and it makes him, it just makes him so like fed up with the modern world that he's like, oh God, I would just love to be at the Lake Isle of Innisfree. And so that's what leads him to write that poem. So there's actually this sort of like urban rural tension in the creation of that poem itself. Susanna, and then Mark, and then Jeroen. And then
I just want to Kurt, I like the reading, and there's another reading about the feelings in it. The current of his feeling failed, he became his virus. So that's happened on the plane of feelings, whereas the instruments of the fail, and the feeling fails as well.
Mark, and then Jeroen.
Let me get back to the line, the day of his death was a dark and cold day. Did you notice that these are monosyllabic words? You only have one syllable. Each word consists of one syllable. He disappeared in the dead of winter, and now he has left us, and we are alone. All words only have one syllable. There isn't a second one that goes with all these words.
The day of his death was a dark, cold day. There's a nice meter in there too. Jeroen?
Yeah, I was elaborating on what Jenny said about all the different kind of landscapes. Essentially, when we talk about is poetry, there are two kinds of things. This really agricultural thing, like make it whatever wine or something like that. And on the other hand, you have the urban. He is scattered among 100 cities, and so I think it's almost tragic that to find his happiness in another kind of wood. So the wood is the only place that is not urban and not agriculture. It's the only place of wilderness, and it's the only it's the only place where the poet can find his happiness when his words are being tossed over and eaten and everything. So he has to get away from his poetry to be happy.
That's really fascinating, and I think you know, troubles some of the urban rural paradigms we would apply to an understanding of this poem, where and this is true also of the Yeats poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, where it's all about him building a cabin in the wilderness and sort of creating civilization in the wild. And now we have here this image of Yeats's spirit in some way, you know, going somewhere wild where it can't be consumed, digested, or in some way like metabolized by society or civilization. Yeah, that's a cool understanding. It's sort of frontier here of you know, where you know, where can poetry go to sort of be pure poetry in some way. We're at time here. So I mean, if we have like a couple minutes, I would invite like any final thought on this, but we can start to wrap this up. And we could like with any poem we could talk about it forever. Unfortunately, we don't have forever though. Does anybody any final thought on this poem?
Can anybody comment on the third section? It's so different to all the other sections. It has this sing-songy language. It sounds silly, funny, and if it is an elegy, why this sing-songy language at the end? Is it Robin from A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare talking to the audience? You know, in Shakespeare, you always have these rhymes at the end of his plays.
It is surprisingly sing-songy, and I I do find it somewhat strange.
It doesn't really fit,
the allusion to like a Shakespearean comedy is apt though. Unia?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say I think the rhymes and stuff just contribute to the whole positive attitude, the positive tone of the last stanza, because I think it's so nice. I don't remember who said earlier that this poem has this positive voice, whereas the other one we read was really negative. And I think it's so nice that even though Yeats has died and it's an elegy, which I find really interesting thought, it's nice that he ends so positively, and it's all about that poetry lives on. And even though it's not in the control of the poet anymore, and everyone can basically do whatever they want with the poem, it's nice that poetry is seen as this healing fountain, as they say at the end, because it's, I mean, wherever you read it and whenever you read it, you always see something new. There's new water bubbling to the surface, and you can just find something new every time.
Thanks, Unia. Jenny?
Just a very quick thank you to Mary, because I've never really read Auden at all. And I think this poem is so astounding in all sorts of different ways, but particularly in his use of language and his form, that I really want to explore him. So thank you for a whole new place to go, Mary.
Thank you, Mary. Indeed. Thank you so much for this recommendation. And next time we'll be reading a poem that you requested, Jenny. And so I've I put up the schedule for next time, which is October 8th. I believe it's October 8th. So we'll read a Ginsberg poem and a contemporary poem that's riffing on that Ginsberg poem. Stanley, do you have something to say?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to close saying thank you, Max, for having this, because as Al said on Wednesday, he doesn't teach his classes anymore. He convenes his classes and allows them to figure out. In his first year class, he said, okay, we got 8 poems here. What do we want to do? What do we want to talk about? And he allowed the students to actually talk about what they wanted. And this is what I feel like. I didn't know anything about Auden. I knew a little bit about Yeats, not much, but I read the poem to I have a poetry group every Tuesday we meet, and we just rub words together is what we say. And it's 5 or 6 old guys, and we read poems that, you know, Billy Collins, whatever. But I read The Second Coming, and one of the 5 guys there actually got tears in his eyes with the Slouching to Bethlehem. And I said to my wife, what do you think that did to him? And she said, well, he's probably, you know, pretty much a Christian or whatever. But I read that poem out loud to them, and I got some pretty good reactions. And now on Tuesday, I think I'll read the Auden poem. But, you know, we just take turns reading poems that we like and rubbing words together. And that's kind of what we did today. Thank you, Max. And I'll be glad to come back in October.
Well, thanks all of you for tuning in. And I'm so pleased that we have such a large and dedicated group, and also that we have some new faces in our midst too. That the group is growing, and I know that we have some folks from last, you know, some regulars who wanted to join, couldn't join today. So we'll hopefully be seeing them in October, and I hope to see all of you again, new folks. Please come back. Any questions for me here at the end of our session? Yeah, so I have I'll send around a reminder for our next meeting, which will take place on October 8th at 3 o'clock Central European Summertime, which is technically 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, but that's actually 2 p.m. UK time at the moment. So you can use Google if there's any confusion, but we'll be meeting at 3 o'clock German time. On Saturday, October 8th, and I'll send around more information about that, including the poems that we'll be discussing, and I'll do that about a week before we meet. So thanks everyone, enjoy your Saturdays. It's really super dreary in Berlin. I hope that it's a little sunnier wherever you all are. Is it, Jenny? Is it okay?
Yeah, absolutely beautiful sun. This morning I went picking blackberries and got too hot.
Oh, making me
Not at a
jealous.
super high temperature, but the sun's warm.
You have to, well, that's better than overcast and drizzling, but not committing to raining, which is exactly what we have here.
And is Anna actually a student of Marx? Is that what?
Yep.
Wow. Thank you. The difference is spreading, guys.
Take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekends, and see you in October.
See you.
Ciao.
Bye.